Hi, I'm Lou. Does fire lighting get you hot under the collar? Do you know your Tinder from your Kindling? Well, in this video, we're going to take a basic look at how to light a fire safely, and particularly looking at using fire at forest school. So as a forest school leader, I really like using fire as a tool for working with people. It has numerous different benefits. It has the practical elements of, it's winter, you want to keep cold, so, a nice fire to get around can be really useful, or you can cook on it, you can boil water for hot chocolate with it. You can understand more about the science and the properties of different materials and how they change when they burn on the fire. It helps us understand about taking managed risks and how to interact safely with a fire. But my particular favourite reason for using fire is the community building and the emotional development elements of fire. Somehow the fire creates like a heart space where people will want to naturally gather and naturally start talking and telling stories or sharing anecdotes from their lives. And there's something very powerful about fire in helping people with that sort of therapeutic process. So I particularly like using fire at forest school for those reasons. Of course, like anything at forest school, we have to balance the possible risks with those benefits. So as a forest school practitioner, you would need to do a full risk-benefit analysis on lighting a fire and thinking about the group that you're working with. Are they ready to have a fire yet, or is it still too early to know how they would react to that? Also do a little bit of research about the people that you're working with. I've met individuals that are really terrified by fire. Perhaps they've had a really negative experience in their life. Maybe there's been a house fire or something and they're really, really scared. So that's important to know that before you have a fire. So in this video, we're going to be exploring just the basic elements of fire building, keeping a safe space. We'll also talk about managing the group potentially at forest school, and just those basic things to get you started at forest school with fire. So before you get started, it's important to be aware of the legal side of lighting fires. It's actually against the law to light a fire on a piece of land unless you've got landowner's consent. So do make sure that you've spoken to your landowner, and from a forest school point of view, I would recommend that you get the consent in writing from the landowner as well, saying that you've got permission to have fires in your forest school area. We're going to look at one particular way of lighting a fire. It's not the only way of lighting a fire, it's just the strategy that I've found works best. It's a fairly reliable method, and we're also going to do it in a way that we're going to leave no trace in the woodland after we've used it. So it's important to consider environmental considerations as we do this. You might have a fixed fire area in your forest school site, in which case you might leave that there permanently and you're not going to clear away or trace. So I will talk through what that might look like in a fixed site as well. So the first step in having a fire safely is to think about the site and the area that you're having it in. So you want a nice clear space with no overhanging branches, no structures or tarpaulins too close. I would say as a rough guide, at least use sort of 5 meters away from anything that might be overhanging. We also need to consider the ground and the actual soil type itself. In woodlands, we've got lots of lovely rich leaf litter that, particularly in dry conditions, can ignite. So we want to clear away an area right back to the bare mineral ground. We're also looking for stuff like this that looks like it could be a tree root, a surface tree root. We don't want to have fires on top of tree roots because technically that could lead to setting fire to the tree if the fire travels down the root. So we want to avoid any surface roots. We want to clear back the area until we see the soil. Now, as I've cleared this soil, what I'm noticing is there are some small stones. Now, I'm going to take these out, I'm going to remove these because in Norfolk we've got quite a lot of flint, and flint is a type of rock that I know explodes when heated. So there's a chance that if you leave stones in the surface of where you're going to have a fire, they could fracture and explode, and then you've got red hot shrapnel coming out of your fire. So best to take out any stones. Not all stones explode, so igneous stones won't explode, but if you don't know your igneous from your metamorphic, then best to remove all stones. So I'm having a really good look at what's underneath here. I'm also kind of looking for what the soil type might be like. Now, if you don't know how to distinguish between soil types, if you look on the internet, you can find different tests for finding out whether your soil is clay or sandy or peaty. And it's peat soil that you want to look out for, because peat will burn as a fuel. And again, I live in Norfolk, and in Norfolk we've got quite a lot of peat. In fact, the Norfolk Broads were created as medieval peat diggings for fuel. So we want to make sure that we're not lighting a fire directly on a peat soil, because it will burn, and it can burn underground for a long time and cause problems. So don't light on a peat soil. But this is actually quite a sandy soil by the looks of it, and you can see it kind of you can actually see some of the sand particles in it, and you can see that the soil is sort of disintegrating under my fingers. So once you get under the rich leaf litter, you'll find what soil type you've got. If you can't light a fire directly on the ground because you found that it is a peat soil, or just perhaps you haven't got permission to have it on the ground, then there are alternatives for you. You could use something like this. You know, you can buy these in most kind of DIY garden centre type shops. So a fire pit, for example, so you've got the legs that raise it up off the ground. It's not going to cause any burning on the actual ground itself. Something to bear in mind though is if you are using one of these, it's introducing an extra element of hot metal that, for some people, if they're new to using fire, I'm thinking younger children, they might not realise that that gets hot. It's not so obvious as flames. So that's something to bear in mind with hot metal. Other options that you could use as well, such as you could harvest some fresh green logs. If you imagine soaring green logs, and you could create like a table, like a base on top of the ground, and because those logs would be green, if you're only having a fire for a short time, they probably wouldn't burn through, so they act as like a protective layer. Another option is, if you've got a permanent fire area and you've got permission to do so, is you could bury some, or partially bury some bricks. These are bricks out of an old storage heater, so they won't crack under heat, and so they're being used as a protective layer in an area that you're having repeated fires on. If you can't get hold of appropriate bricks, you could also potentially use clay and kind of make a little divot and clay line the divot, and then the heat of the fire will kind of bake the clay and it adds a protective layer. So we've prepared the ground, but as an extra step for forest school, I want to make it really obvious where the fire's going to be, where the hot stuff's going to be. And so to do that, I'm going to just create a little fire surround using some logs. So I've just got simply 4 reasonable sized logs, and I'm making a square or a rectangle, and this is going to perform a couple of functions. So firstly, it's a visual function so that the learners know hot stuff stays inside this square, so it's a no-go area, no one steps into the fire surround. Secondly is if your fire is tall and it kind of collapses, this will help kind of keep things inside the surround and stop things rolling out, and if it was a dry day, potentially stop it rolling into dry leaf litter and things like that. So it's kind of helping contain the area. Because I'm doing a leave no trace fire today, I'm going to just literally leave the logs as they are sitting on top of the ground. If I was making a permanent fire area, I would probably go to a bit more effort and maybe get slightly bigger logs and also peg them in so that they wouldn't roll away themselves. So I'd actually fix them in place if it was a permanent area. But because we're kind of going to use this as a fire and then we're going to clear up and leave no trace, I'm not going to do that today. So once we're happy with our site, we need to think about elements of people and making sure we keep ourselves safe. So a few things to think about is, well, firstly, before you even have a real life fire, where are the group with that understanding? Will they understand what a fire is? Will they understand how to behave around it and how to move safely around it? So often at Forest School, the fire area will have some sort of seating associated with it. And so you might need to think about what would be an appropriate distance to put the seating at. I know certain forest schools and forest school trainers will prescribe a set distance of having the seating at a certain distance. I personally don't do that because it varies depending on the group and it depends on the need of the fire. So for example, if it's a very cold winter's day, of course, if you're too far away from the fire, you're not getting the benefit of the heat of the fire. But if you've got a group of children, perhaps who are unpredictable in their behaviour, if you had them too close, of course that makes them more at risk if they were to suddenly jump up and jump over the fire. So you might want to think about where you put your seats based on the learners and based on the conditions also as well. Something that often happens at Forest School is, certainly with younger children, is we might play some games around the fire area before we have a lit fire in place. Maybe we'll put a pretend fire or a picture of a fire in there. And so some of those rules, for want of a better word, would be like nobody enters the circle around the fire, so where all the seats are, nobody will kind of step into that circle unless they've been invited by the adult who's responsible for the fire, maybe to toast a marshmallow or to toast a bread twirl or something like that. And so when they move around the fire, they need to make sure that they step up and go behind their seating and walk round the outside of the seats. And then they might practice games like, you know, swap places. If you're wearing green and you have to step up, go outside the circle and swap places with somebody else. So that might be practiced. Also in forest schools, you might want to make sure that the approach to the fire is designated as a walking zone rather than running, because of course in forest school some people are very active and they're doing lots of cool stuff and they're running along, but you might not want them to approach the fire at a run. And you also want to be perhaps particularly aware of any trip hazards that might be in that walking zone. So for example, if you've got brambles and things like that, you might want to clear those away so people don't trip over them as they're kind of walking towards the fire. So keep it clear of trip hazards too. Something else to think about is for the people who are lighting the fire, managing the fire, or coming up to the fire to cook, so that could be the adults or the children in that case, is consider how their personal appearance is, and whether they've got anything dangly like long hair or necklaces or scarves that might kind of fall into the fire as they're working over it. So I've got kind of crazy long hair, so I need to find my hairband to tie it up before I light the fire, so that I know it's not going to fall in the fire, because burnt hair smells awful. And it's also not good fun to singe your hair, so kind of tie that up. If it was winter, I also would want to make sure that I've got no gloves on my hands, particularly like the fleecy warm gloves that you wear at winter, because they just melt if they get hot, and then you get molten plastic on your hands, which is not good. So make sure you've got no gloves on your hands when you're lighting the fire too. So then finally, before we are ready to light our fire, we also need to make sure that we've got appropriate emergency equipment in case something goes wrong. We want to be prepared. So our emergency equipment that we need is a watering can full of water. So this watering can holds at least 5 litres, and that's full up. Watering can I prefer because it kind of disperses the water rather than chucks on like a big, which can create a big plume of steam like a bucket. So we've got our watering can. We've also got our plunge bucket that is full of clean water. So the watering can's for if the fire gets out of control and we need to put it out. The plunge bucket is for if somebody burns themselves, because the most common place to be burnt will be your hands. If somebody burns their hands, you've got access to cold, clean water straight away, and you can dunk your hands straight in there from a first aid point of view. So you've got your plunge bucket. And then finally, I also keep a fire blanket hung up in a tree, and this is more for if someone was unfortunate enough to have their clothing set on fire and you needed to wrap them, to extinguish that. Because unfortunately, a lot of outdoor kit is made out of synthetic fabrics, which tends to melt and stick to skin rather than natural fibres, which are much more fire retardant. So things like cottons and wools, it's quite hard to light on fire, but things like the plastic synthetic fibres are actually fairly easy to set on fire. And of course most people are wearing waterproofs and things like that would melt if they were caught a spark. So that's particularly for that. So I'm going to hang that up on one of my trees. It's important to have your fire blanket hung up rather than just lying on the ground, because it means if you need to use it, you can quickly pull down and release the blanket rather than fiddling and faffing, because in moments when somebody's got up in flames, you want that blanket rather quickly. So hanging it up means you can get it easily. I've also got my first aid rucksack, affectionately known as Alan the rucksack, and inside there, as well as normal first aid provision, there is also sort of burns equipment and things as well. So we've got that to hand in case we need it. So it could also be useful to practice certain emergency procedures, and particularly with younger groups who might not be used to fire and still might be quite clumsy in the woodlands. And so knowing the stop, drop and roll system of if any of your clothes did get on fire, that's what you need to do. You need to stop, you need to drop, and you need to roll. And so I'm very fortunate to have my friend James here to help us to do a little scenario. So say someone was coming into the fire area and they weren't necessarily abiding by the rules, and then big flamey fire is on fire. So you need to stop, James, you need to stop, you need to drop, and you need to roll. And then I can go and get my fire blanket like this, the little tags you use to protect your hands, and then you can, there we go, stop you flaming. It's all right. A close call.
Close call. Close
A
call.
close call. So that's how you use a flyer blanket. So in order to get the driest wood for your fire, you want to look for twiggy bits that are hanging up, caught in the branches of the trees. And this means even if it has been wet weather, the wind still would have been blowing and air drying this wood, and so it should be still nice and dry. And the way you know that wood is nice and dry for your fire is you snap it and you're wanting to hear those crunchy, clicky sounds that suggest that there's low moisture content. So if it doesn't go crack, then it's probably no good for your fire. And this is something that I teach the children to listen for, like listen for the nice crack to get the dry wood. And so we'll go and collect lots of wood from this nice giving tree here. La la la. That's a nice bit. So once you've collected all your lovely hanging deadwood for your fire, we want to prepare the sticks in a certain way so that we know that we've got everything ready before we light, so we don't have to scramble around desperately finding bits of wood. So good preparation is key to successful fire lighting. And we've got 3 sizes of wood here for the kindling. So we've got the really thin stuff here, which is kind of as thin as a match and kind of like the hand span of your hand is kind of a rough guide. And then the second pile we've got here are what I would call the pencil kind of size pieces. So they are kind of about the same width and the same length. Well, as a long pencil in this case. So your pencil size pieces. And then in your final pile, you've got things that are kind of about the size of your thumb in terms of width. And then I use sort of my forearm as a measurement in terms of length. So from your elbow, between elbow and wrist, and elbow and fingertip is a good kind of size. So we're using body measurements at Forest School so that potentially the size of the fire is the sort of right size for the size of the person. So a 4-year-old's fire is going to be smaller than a 15-year-old's fire by using the body measurements to help us. So that's our kindling. We also need tinder, which is the first thing that you put on your fire, and you can use a variety of different things for your tinder, both natural and man-made. So man-made, for example, could be something as simple as old bits of newspaper scrunched up into a ball, or bits of cotton wool, which you can add Vaseline or petroleum jelly to make sort of little fire starters. But natural ones, you could use various outer barks of trees, various inner barks of certain tree species, and you can also collect like fluffy plant downs like thistle down and things like that. Because of the woodland that I'm in today, I'm chosen to use some birch bark as our tinder, and birch bark is naturally resinous, so it has volatile oils in it that actually helps accelerate and start that fire going. So I've chosen birch bark today for our tinder. You'll also notice that I've laid the wood and the tinder out on this rather funkily coloured blanket just to keep it off the ground. You don't want to spend all that time collecting the nice dry wood from the branches of the trees and then put it straight down onto the ground where it would start to absorb moisture. So if you have got a tarp or a blanket or something just to keep it off the ground, then that's recommended to keep it as dry as possible. So now we've done all our safety checks, we're ready to start laying and lighting the fire. Now, this is just one particular way of doing it. There are lots of other ways of doing it. So what we are going to do is we're going to create something called the Tipi Lay of fire. And I find this particular shape really useful because it's like a big triangle. And it helps draw the air through, and therefore for starting a fire it can be a really effective technique. We're also going to do it in a forest school way where we're going to add kind of all the wood right at the beginning, and so depending on what I was using the fire for, I might need to put more or less wood on. But say we were going to toast some bread on a stick or something like that, we're going to add all the wood that we would need for that task, and because that then reduces the need to add more wood once the fire's burning. So this is a really good technique if learners have got to the point where they're lighting and managing their own fires, because it means they don't have to keep fiddling with the fire and adding wood and bringing their hands closer, which is where they might then burn themselves. So this is a real kind of like beginner's fire lay. So to start off with, we need to create a raft of sticks in our fire surround. So we've already prepped the ground, it's clear of anything that might explode or might catch on fire. And I'm just going to put some sticks down to make a little platform, to make a little raft. And this is going to do two things. It's going to keep the tinder up off the direct ground, so away from any moisture, but it's also going to act as sort of like an air flow system. So rather than things getting all squashed and compressed down, it means the air still can get up underneath the fire and flow through, because you need oxygen. That's one of the three things you need for fire. You need a good oxygen flow to it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to put the tinder on top of our raft. Now, because this birch bark is quite chunky birch bark, I'm going to give it a good sort of rip up to try and maximise the surface area. So for your tinders and the fine kindling, surface area matters. You want things to be small so that they get hot quicker and therefore ignite more quickly. So increasing that surface area. Again, at forest school, if we have got learners that are interested in fire lighting, we might start talking to them about the fire triangle and kind of some of the science behind fire. So the fire triangle is the three things that fires need to burn. So we mentioned oxygen being one of those things. The other two things are fuel, sufficient fuel. So breaking fuel into smaller or thinner pieces is going to increase that surface area. So that's one of the three as well. And then there's also heat, or a point of ignition. So it's oxygen, fuel and heat make the fire triangle. If you remove any one of those three things, then your fire will go out. So in terms of successful fire lighting, if you go back to basics, go back to those three things: is enough air getting to my fire? Is my fuel the right diameter so that the heat can transfer? And that's usually kind of all the ways of problem solving your fire. So I've got my tinder there, my birch bark. As I say, that could be rolls of newspaper, it could be cotton wool, it could be fluffy plant downs, whatever you're using, but your tinder goes on first. Then the two big handfuls of matchstick size kindling is your next bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to crisscross these directly on top of our tinder, straight on top, because heat rises. So when I light the birch bark, I want all this fine stuff to be in the path of that heat, so it will heat up and ignite. So 1, 2. Now, it's a dry day today, so I've done 2 big handfuls. If it was raining, if it was a really wet day, I might need even more of this fine stuff, possibly double the amount, because it's this fine matchstick stuff that builds the heat in your fire and will determine whether or not your fire is successful or not. So you can never have enough of the fine matchstick size pieces. Next, we've got the pencil size pieces, and so we're going to change now the shape from straight up to creating a little teepee shape, so a sort of a triangular shape. So I'm going to take these pieces and put them at an angle so that it goes all around the outside of the fire. And with your teepee shape, you want them to be quite steep. You want it to be at height. If your fire goes flat, then it's harder for the oxygen to get into it, and often flat fires go out. So you want height to your fire. You want it nice and steep. Now, I'm being a bit slapdash at this, but some people will take great care at doing this. I'll put on these pieces. Now, I haven't actually put the sticks all the way around. I haven't done it at 360 degrees. I've actually left a little gap over this side. So I've left a gap this side because at the moment I'm upwind of the fire, and so I need a gap to be able to get to the tinder at the bottom, and I'm going to keep upwind because then it means that the wind will help blow the flames and the heat into the fire. So we're kind of leaving a little door basically so that we can get to the tinder still. So I'm not doing it all the way around. And then finally, we've got the thumb size pieces, those longer bits that's sort of the length of your arm. And we're going to do a second layer to the teepee. So we've got one layer of pencil size pieces and then a second outer layer of the thicker pieces. Now, if you do have some size difference in this pile, which we do, we've got some that are very little and we've got some that are a bit fatter, I would suggest starting with the thinner ones, put those ones on first and then put the fatter ones on afterwards. So a trick to successful fire lighting is slowly increase the diameter of the wood. Don't go too fat too quickly because the heat might struggle to ignite the thicker pieces until it gets hotter. So we've built the fire and we're nearly ready to light. So before I do that, I like to do a few last minute checks. So firstly is the wind direction, because we want to know where the smoke's going to go, and we also want to light it from an upwind position, both for the fire to successfully ignite, but also so that the flames don't blow back at us. So I'm making sure I've got the wind behind me. It's also worth thinking about what the group is up to, because sometimes things change in a forest school session. You know, has something just kicked off, like behavioural wise, which you're thinking, oh, maybe it's not so good to have a fire today, perhaps. It's always good just double checking those things. I've also made sure I've got a poking stick, so that if I do need to move any of the sticks once it's lit, I don't need to use my hands. I can use my poking stick for that job. And again, even as an adult at forest school, I'll model that so that the children you know, will understand not to touch things with their hands around the fire. So I've got my sturdy poking stick at the ready. And we're going to light the fire now. Now, there are lots of different methods of lighting a fire, from bow drill and fire by friction, all the way through using different chemicals that sizzle and explode, all the way through to using like flint and steel. Lots of different methods. Because this is just the beginning video of forest school, I'm going to use matches because, you know, they're things that are easily available to get, and I'm sure we've all got them at home. I recommend using like the barbecue matches because they are longer. You can get into places more easily, and I recommend using the barbecue matches because they're longer. So striking a match, there is a technique to it, which again, if we're working with learners at forest school and they're getting to a point where they're able to handle fire lighting themselves, sometimes just teaching them how to strike a match and hold it safely might be a starting point, because for some learners they might be very, very scared. You know, they're told to be scared of matches, don't play with matches. So there might be fear around handling things that have got a flame. And now often the technique you see of striking matches is this, where you're kind of like pushing down on the body of the match, and this happens, exactly that happens, because you're not working with the strength of the match. So a technique that I usually share to people striking a match is one that works with the length of the grain of the match, so it doesn't snap when you're striking it. So what you do is you hold the match as if you were like throwing a dart between your thumb and your forefinger. And then I often sometimes use my little finger as an additional support as well. And then you strike down, and then you can, of course, cup it. It's a windy day. But you strike down using the length of the wood of the match, so it's less likely to snap. Just a little tip that if you've only got a box of matches and you keep snapping them, then your fire's going to struggle. So we might practice that at the beginning with learners before they light their own fire. You know, can they strike a match? So we're going to use our match now to strike into the fire. So you notice I'm going to be quite close to the fire to do this. It's quite a breezy day today, so the fire, the flame might go out. So I'm going to keep my matchbox quite close. I'm going to strike down and get straight away under this tinder. So I'm going to look for a good spot where I think that I'm going to kind of put the match, and I'm going to hold it there for a length of time. So here we go. The good thing about the barbecue matches is you have got quite a long stick on your match, so keep holding it. Oh, it's a windy day. And you see, with certain tinders like this birch bark, you have to position, you know, where you want the flame quite carefully. But you can hear all that sizzling, and that's all the resins in the birch bark. And also the fine matchstick kindling is also birch, so it's very resinous as well. So you can see how that once it's got hot enough, it gets very excited about being on fire, and those resinous oils will help. So that big bundle of flame is all the little matchsticks. You see how that high surface area is really building up the heat. It's creating like a big fireball inside. The thicker bits on the outside haven't yet taken, but as the heat builds, the fire will get hot enough to ignite the thicker pieces. And it's a good job we got our wind direction right, because the flames are blowing away from us and not towards. So as I mentioned, this is the Tipi Fire Lay, and you can see because of the height of it, it burns with a very big flame, a very tall flame. And the Tipi Fire Lay, I guess, would be a traditional fire lay used for if it was an evening and you wanted to sit around it, you needed a lot of lights or a lot of heat to keep warm by. It would be a good one to sit round a fire and sing songs or tell stories, because you'll get a lot of light and heat from this fire lay. But you can see now that the thicker pieces are starting to ignite, certainly the pencil pieces, some of the thumb pieces are igniting now. If you need to rearrange anything, I've got my trusty poking stick, so I can use that to reposition pieces of wood if I need to. And at the moment, this, although it's great for light and heat, it's no good for cooking on. So if we did want to cook a marshmallow, or we wanted to toast some bread on a stick or something, at the moment we couldn't do it on this fire. It's too flamey. What we're waiting for is for the teepee itself to collapse down, and we want a nice bed of embers that is glowing but not flaming, because we would just burn everything in this fire. So as we watch, now it's nice and hot, it should start collapsing, which is actually what we want if we're going to cook. So you can see once the height of the fire drops, the height of the flames drops. So it becomes a bit more manageable. So you can see that that fire has changed quite a lot from the big flamey triangle to nice burnt down glowing embers. So if we did want to cook on this fire, then now is the time. This is what we want it to look like, not a big flamey pile, but there's still plenty of heat in there. So I've prepared my toasting stick, and I fortunately have a crumpet. So let's see if we can give this a toast. So you will notice that I'm still making sure I'm upwind so that I'm not getting heat or flame blowing at me, and I'm also going to make sure I've got 3 points of contact, so if I do need to stand up and leave the area for some reason, I can do that quite quickly. So I'm using my 3-point stance, we call that. So you've got one knee up and one knee down, and then I can safely toast my crumpet over the embers. Nice. Needs butter though. Now it's time to extinguish our fire. So I always like to give our fire a little bit of thanks, a little bit of gratitude for doing what it's done for us this session. Thank you for letting me toast a crumpet and giving us some heat. Give the fire some gratitude. But now, because it's still flaming, I need to make sure that the flames all are out. So I'm going to use my poking stick and go separate out the fuel, because when you separate the fuel out, that immediately kind of cools the fire down, or at least reduces the heat, so that you can see that most of it there has stopped flaming. So I spread out those embers as well to start that process. So in terms of the fire triangle that I mentioned earlier, we've spread out the fuel. Now I'm going to get my watering can that's plenty full of water, and it's always good to just check that there's nobody downwind before you do this, because otherwise they get a big plume of steam in their face. And I'm going to gently use the watering can that disperses the water out. Now, if the children are helping with this, I tell them to look for any glowing bits, look for the sparkles, and then you can see that there's a sparkle over there still, so we need to put a bit more water there. You can also see that certain bits, like that bit here, is steaming quite a lot there, so that obviously needs a bit more water. There's something still going on there. And then if we visually can't see anything, we can use our poking stick again. Just give that a bit of a stir, and particularly if there's any bigger bits that are left unburnt, kind of it's good to use the stick to turn those over to have a good look, because they might look like they're out on top but underneath they're still burning. And then we can keep going with the water until it's really stops steaming. It's also worth not forgetting the fire surrounds, because sometimes, like you see this one, it's being a bit scorched. If it's a windy day in particular, sometimes the fire can actually start burning the fire surround. So you want to make sure that these pieces are definitely not carrying any embers or fire. So really well saturate it. If you've had quite a big fire, or a fire that's been burning for a long time, it's quite surprising how much water you need sometimes, so do always make sure you've got plenty of water to put out the fire that you've been using. I'm just going to give that another little stir. Okay, now because this fire we also want to leave no trace, I need to make sure it's completely out, because I'm going to handle the remains in a minute. So I'm going to use the back of my hand, and I'm just feeling for any hot patches. So I'm just hovering an inch or so above, and there's actually still a bit of a hot patch there. So I'm going to put a little bit more water, particularly in that area. Make sure it's really cool. And then when I'm confident that the pieces are still not hot, because I'm feeling for that, then I'm going to just very gently, again with the back of my hand, just feel that things are cool enough to touch. So you've noticed some of these big pieces like this, it's still very warm, but it's not on fire. I can now touch that piece, because I don't want to disperse any of this into the environment if it's still burning. So I'm checking by actually handling these things. So that feels to me like it's fully out. Okay. So because we're in a woodland where we don't want to leave the remains of a fire kind of messily about, and in some sites you might only have permission to have a fire if you leave no trace, because they don't want to attract other people to have fires. So we need to make sure that people can't tell where we've been today having this fire. So that means, well, I'm going to disperse my fire surround a bit later, but I need to look at all of this sort of leftover charcoal. And this also does affect the soil. So from an environmental point of view, do be aware that having a fire is kind of like a really fast burning compost heap. So you've changed the chemistry of the soil in this particular patch. So all the kind of nutrients and stuff from the ash and from the charcoal kind of gets leached into the soil. So that actually affects the soil chemistry and might affect the plants that might come and grow here in the future. So to try and reduce that a bit, we're going to scoop up some of the remains, and we're going to disperse it into the woods. Woo! Giving thanks, casting to the four winds, giving thanks for the fire. Oh, this is the bit I love. It's nice and messy. So we don't want to put it in one spot. We're going to spread it out so that kind of enrichment of the soil is more spread rather than concentrated in one spot. Ooh. Of course, if there's any kind of big bits like this, you could save this charcoal, use it for artwork as well. You could, okay, so we've cleared all that partly burnt wood, the charcoal, we've scattered that to minimise the impact, and now we need to recover the soil with the leaf litter. If you remember at the beginning, we scraped back the leaf litter, so now we know it's cool. We can take some of that leaf litter and disperse it again. So hopefully that kind of covers up the scar of the black charcoal. So hopefully now you can't really see where we've had the fire, that it's kind of leave no trace, or at least as close as can be to leave no trace. So there's the basics of fire lighting at Forest School. I hope you found that useful. If you want to develop your skills further, then I have got another video about managing fire and looking at different fire lays, and also a bit about species selection of firewood. So do check that out. The link's in the description below. If you've enjoyed this video, do give us a thumbs up and subscribe so you can join us in the woods next time. And thanks for watching. Fire at Forest School can be fun. Just keep safe so you don't get well done. Fire at Forest School can be fun. Just keep safe so you don't get well done. Follow the tips to light one with ease. Just pick a safe space so you don't set fire to the trees.